Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this incredible plenary session. My name is Lauren Reed, and I'm the Communication and Community Engagement Coordinator at the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison. When Danielle Sered generously agreed to present at our virtual NCHEP, my mind went back to when I first heard about her work and her book a few years ago. I was walking in Manhattan on a warm afternoon together with my friend Bibi, chatting about how far we had come from conversations in the prison kitchen to now walking the streets of New York as free women, doing the work to help those still left behind the walls. Our conversation led to Bibi telling me about the book Until We Reckon, which she had just read and told me that it was something that I needed to read immediately. When I finally read the book, I again thought about that moment we were strolling through the streets of Manhattan while repairing our souls and continuing the work we said we would do when we were in that prison. Danielle Sered's book is incredibly important to this field and to me personally, as I was convicted of a violent offense. Danielle focuses on restorative justice by stirring up the binary of violent outcomes and nonviolent transgressions, bringing to light the difficult conversations around violence while challenging us through this crucial narrative. Danielle brings forth a solution instead of ignoring the impact of violence, and she addresses directly with the contradictions in our society. Please welcome to the screen the one and only Danielle Sered, and let us learn together what we can do beyond the systems of punishment and oppression. Thank you.
Every single one of those things most natural to us are disrupted in the very structures of prisons, from the physical structures to the rules to the ways humans engage with one another to the separation from others. Um, and so to do something that is just a human thing in a context that is built to disrupt basic human function requires an incredible degree of wisdom and insight and creativity and strategy. And I did some work teaching in prisons. I taught creative writing in prisons in Georgia when I was in college. I've taught since. I did some work with Penn America in prisons related to there. And in some ways, it was the project of working in prisons that set me on a path to building alternatives to prison, just because of the enormity of the pain and the enormity of the constraints. And so I join you tonight with just enormous respect for what you do to navigate those constraints, with real humility about it, and with real clarity that the things I offer will some of you'll find which ones you can get through to the other side of the walls, and you'll know better than I do how to do that. And so thank you, first of all, for what you do. And so I'll talk tonight some about responses to violence in case it's of use where you are, like where you're situated, um, and in the project of ensuring that fewer and fewer people are behind bars in our country. um, so at Common Justice, we develop and advance solutions to violence, that meet the needs of those who are harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on incarceration. And at the core of our work, we operate an alternative to incarceration program based in restorative justice practices for serious and violent felonies. So people who have committed crimes like stabbings, shootings, gunpoint robberies, with the consent of the district attorney and of the victim of their crime, are diverted into a program where, after extensive preparation, they sit with those they've hurt, they acknowledge the impact, and together everyone reach agreements about how the responsible person can make things as right as possible. If the responsible person completes those agreements and the rest of our program, the felony charges against them are dismissed and they don't serve time. And in the meantime, we work with the people they hurt to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And the program is really deeply rooted in what we believe are the four core guiding principles that should guide any responses to violence. And so I'll talk about those four principles tonight. The first of those is that responses to violence should be survivor centered. It seems like a normal principle and a common one. We talk all the time about doing criminal justice reform in victims' names. We have Marcy's Law and Sarah's Law and other Caroline's Law, mostly laws named after white women who have been hurt. We talk in the news all the time about victims breathing a sigh of relief when someone is locked up. And we see press conferences where people push back against progressive criminal justice reform, including basic things like access to higher education in prison, in victims' names. But the truth is, the thing we almost never do is actually ask victims what they want. First, we have a misconception of who victims are. It's white women like me on most of the victim service posters, when a young man of color is 10 times more likely than me to be robbed and assaulted, and a woman of color is at least that many times as likely to me as than me to be a victim of violence. And so we have an artificially monolithic idea of who victims are that is inscripted in our long-standing racialized narratives in these countries about who causes harm and who is supposed to be protected from harm. And those stories erase the realities of who survivors are and to what they're entitled. But we also, in addition to erasing the experience of Black and Brown survivors, we also erase the experiences of survivors who don't just want blood. The survivors' voices who get elevated are typically those who support the most draconian sentencing, the ones whose interests are aligned with the interests that prosecutors have already determined or the outcomes they're seeking in a case. And survivors who disagree with those are very often cast aside, both in their individual cases and in the larger public conversation. And I think one of the most important things we've learned at Common Justice, like if there was one thing I could tell everybody and only one, it would probably be this. So I said at the top that we only take cases into in the program if victims of those crimes agree. And so it's worth it to remember fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place. Another half won't make it past grand jury. So that remaining 25% are arguably the jailingest set of victims you'll find. And we talked to the subset of those who have had guns to their head, lacerations to their liver, who were beaten unconscious. And we asked them, do you want the person who hurt you to go to common justice, or do you want them incarcerated? And 90% choose common justice. 90%. It's a wild number. And when I first saw that number, I thought that people were better than I knew, that we were merciful, that we were forgiving, that we thought, but for the grace of God, go I. And I think that's sometimes true. But I think the thing that's really true and that accounts for the vast majority of those yeses is something I should have known as a survivor myself. And so the best way I've been able to describe this is that as survivors, we will feel loss so deep that we would like wring out our bones to be free of it, like it's stored in the marrow there. And we will feel fear so intrusive that in the safety of our own homes, in the arms of the people we trust the most, we will be unable to sleep. And when exhaustion finally takes us, we will wake from that sleep with nightmares. And we will be so experience rage so all-consuming we feel unrecognizable even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, survivors, like, we are pragmatic, and there are two things we can't stand. We can't stand the idea of going through it again, and we can't stand the idea of someone else going through it. And so when we're presented with an option, we seek the choice that is likeliest to prevent the things we can't stand. And the hardest people in the world to persuade that incarceration will keep them safe is anyone who lives in neighborhoods where incarceration is common. We in America lock up more people in this country than any nation in all of human history. If incarceration worked to keep us safe, we would be the safest country to have existed in all of human history. And even more than that, the Black and Brown neighborhoods that bear the brunt of mass incarceration would be centers of previously unimaginable safety, where no one would ever be hurt. That's not the reality that we live in. And so what we know is that prison's failure to produce safety is something that survivors experience in their day-to-day lives. They have paid the price for its failure with their enduring pain. And while they may seek incarceration when the only other option on the table is nothing at all, when they are faced with the presence of multiple options, they almost always prefer just about anything to incarceration. including an intervention like restorative justice. The second principle that guides our responses to violence is we believe that responses to violence should be accountability based. That may also sound obvious. We talk about accountability all the time. We talk about, we understand there were complications, but someone has to be accountable for what they've done. I believe in accountability more deeply than most people I know. It is my life's work. But the problem we have in this country is we treat accountability and punishment as synonymous, when in fact, more and more I've come to understand that they are often incompatible. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something somebody does to me. All I have to do to be punished is not escape it. Accountability is different. Accountability is active. It requires that I acknowledge what I've done, that I acknowledge its impact, that I express genuine remorse, that I make things as right as possible, ideally in ways defined by those I've harmed, and that I become someone who will never cause that kind of harm ever again. It is some of the hardest labor any of us will do. I think often of one of our early participants who had been gang involved since he was 8, and he had committed more violence than anyone should, and seen more violence than anyone should, and survived more violence than anyone should in a lifetime, let alone in the 18 years before we met him. And he sat in a circle process with the young man he had robbed and with that young man's mother, and had to face the impact his choices had on their lives and look into their eyes as he owned his responsibility for it. And we went through the whole circle. We reached agreements about all of it. And at the end, everyone was going home. And he asked me if he could wait in the office for a minute before we left. And it was, almost 9 at night. So I said, why? And he said, I just don't want to go back outside until my hands stop shaking. And this is a young man who I expect can hold a gun steady as day. And he said to me, for everything I've done, everything that's been done to me, I don't know if I've ever heard a real apology before. Like, how do you think I did? And because it was true, I said, I think you did great. And he said, pardon my language, but that's the scariest shit I ever did. Right? Accountability demands something of us, and it demands something that is fundamentally rooted in our humanity. That's something we know deeply from restorative justice work we do. We know it too from some of the long-termers programs that we learn from, like the work that we've gotten to witness up close through that the Osborne Association does here in New York, the journeys they take with people that began with people who were just coming up for parole and extended to people who were doing long bids, whether they were coming up for parole or not, to come to terms with the impact of their actions and the way in which those actions are inextricably intertwined with the pain they themselves survived and never got structural supports to heal. The third principle that we think should guide our responses to violence is that responses to violence should be safety driven. So you may be like, these principles are getting increasingly obvious as we go on. But however much we talk about prisons as a tool of safety, we don't actually have any rigor in our analysis about that. The debate is usually whether prisons produce a lot of safety or just a little safety, or maybe really radical people say they produce no safety. But what I've come to understand as somebody who is first and foremost in the business of ending violence, as opposed to the business of ending prison, is that prisons are productive of violence. So the main drivers of violence are structural. They are things like poverty and inequity. They're lack of access to decent education, to good mental health care, to a hospital system that works, to a public health infrastructure that could do something like distribute vaccines in less than 6 months to a population. All of that, like those are the things that fundamentally drive violence. And in its most basic ways, our commitment to incarceration draws resources from every single one of those life-affirming institutions and exacerbates things like inequity, poverty, mental illness, poor physical health, like all these things that we know create violence. But even on the individual level, even not just thinking globally about what our society prioritizes and why, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. So we have baked into our core responses to violence exactly the things that generate it. It's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline. Like, that's not what you do if you actually want to quell the flames. And so, in my view, as someone, I think a lot about what it means to be committed to the end of violence, right? To really seeing a culture in which violence is at the very least rare, and but certainly culture where it doesn't characterize us. And I think about the violence I myself have survived. I think about the people I have lost to murder. And I think about the people I love who have lost people. I think about like the mothers whose weight I've borne in my arms as they've collapsed like feet from the coffins where their sons' bodies lay. And that's not a weight your body forgets, right? It's like when somehow you become strong enough to care, like hold something you couldn't otherwise hold because it's required of you. And that weight obligates you to something, right? Like it obligates you in a way that I think outlasts probably the length of any one of our lives. And when I think about the obligation I have as someone who has held that weight, when I think about the obligation I have as somebody who's like friend bled out in my arms at 15, like that obligation is to end violence. And so what I do if I want to end violence is I look through my culture, I look through my society for anything that generates violence. And I seek to eradicate that thing because I do not want people to suffer more pain. And if I look honestly and I look rigorously at American culture for sources of violence, for things that generate those outcomes of loss, prison figures centrally as one of those culprits. And so it's in that spirit that I think about and that I invite others to think about the elimination of prison. The elimination of prison is not just about liberation, though it's about that. It is about the production of safety. Um, and so when we think about responses to violence that are safety driven, it means that we are not thinking about responses to violence that are necessarily the most popular, that are rooted, that display our sort of collective desire for revenge or an individual desire for revenge that polled well in a particular district. It requires that we actually look at what the intervention in response to violence is and ask the question, like, what is the likelihood that makes us safer? And look to people's practical lived experience and to the evidence. And if the thing we are doing is likely to make people less safe, then it's our job to stop doing it and to do something else. The last principle that we believe should guide responses to violence is that responses to violence should be racially equitable. They never have been in this country. So this principle for us is not a thing where we can look to one model in one place and replicate it broadly. It is like the deepest, most significant aspirational principle I think we can be called to move toward in America. Um, we've just inflicted extraordinary pain. We have people who will never come home, who will never come home the same, people who have come home with so much loss that they've passed it on to others, like people whose everything from missed birthdays to missed burials will like never be mended, people who had horrific violence inflicted on them, who were held in cells smaller than some of our bathrooms for years on end. Like we did all of this, and we did all of this even in the presence of the evidence that all of it was not producing safety. And as that evidence mounted, we did it more and more and more. And then we told survivors that our doing this would heal them, even in the face of no evidence whatsoever that it would. And we told them if it was not making them feel well, that something was wrong with them. And we weaponized their pain to do it more and more and more. And we did it not exclusively, but vastly disproportionately to people of color who were the descendants of people whom we had enslaved in this nation. Like that is on us. Like what we have done is on us. We have heaped pain on pain on pain. And the only thing I know that we do in the face of that kind of responsibility is to seek a path to repair. I don't know everything about what that kind of collective repair looks like, but I actually don't believe it's that fundamentally different than the basic steps of accountability that I think characterize our response to individual level harm. We acknowledge what we've done. We acknowledge its impact. We express genuine remorse. We make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed. And we can become a people who will never cause that kind of harm ever again. I think those of us who do restorative justice know some things from that process that are useful and maybe transferable to a reckoning of that scale. But the main thing we know is not actually mechanics. Like the thing we know is that the world that is possible on the other side of a reckoning is never fully visible from this side of it. And so the choice to steer into the truth of our nation's history and its persistence in all these forms is not exactly a logical one. It's not like a plea bargain where we're told in advance what the consequence will be before we admit our guilt. It is much more like an act of faith. It is much more like a prayer where we put our whole hearts into it, where we say the thing we know to be the truest thing we can say, and where we leap and trust that something in us, something in one another, will be enough that the thing that arises out of that truth is a transformation. And those of us in restorative justice who have had the huge gift of watching such transformations over and over again, I often think the best thing that we can do for anyone else is testify over and over to the fact that we know we are capable of it and we know it's possible. And so I will stop talking there so that we can focus our attention on the questions, reflections, insults, whatever you have that's closely rooted to the work that you're doing. And so open it up for that.